All right. Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Mark Graven, and today we're joined by two guests. We have Chris Chapman, and we're joined by his wife, Professor Valeria Sinclair-Chapman. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but I'm really excited that we're going to have the chance to talk about some important subjects today, thinking about problem solving and applying that toward really, deeper organizational, if not societal problems. So I'm really glad we have the opportunity. Chris and Val, how are you?
Good, Mark.
Thank you for having us.
I'm glad we can have this conversation. In terms of introductions, we start with Chris, because I met you first, just briefly, by a small margin, because of an article that you published on the Lean Enterprise Institute Lean Post website, Lean In, Lean Thinkers to Root Out Racial Inequity. And we'll talk more about the article, but can you share a little bit more about your background, your experience with Lean and continuous improvement?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Let me first say, Mark, it's a pleasure to be on with you. I've been a fan of yours since reading your book, Lean Hospitals.
Thanks.
And so, it's just a pleasure to discuss the article and, some of the opportunities that we see going forward to use lean process improvement and diversity, equity, and inclusion practices in combination to address systemic racism. Mm-hmm. So my experience, I should probably think back. The beginning of my lean journey started in mid-90s. And so I believe, like you, my lean journey started in manufacturing. And so in mid-90s, I started out in production management at Delphi Automotive Systems, which, as you may recall, was just about the time Delphi was spinning off from General Motors. And so that was a bit of our burning platform to begin really embracing lean practices and implementing lean production systems. At that time, I had the good fortune of being on the team when we were utilizing Jim Womack. So I have fond memories of seeing him walk the Gemba at Delphi. We also utilized Rick Harris, the author of Creating Continuous Flow. So, again, had the good fortune to be learning in an environment with I believe some really strong lean thinkers there. And as fate would have it, at the time, we actually had the pleasure of working with Jim Luckman, who was our plant manager at the time. And he's a part of the LEI, Lean Enterprise Institute faculty. So that's where my lean journey began. From there, I went on to Kodak, where I earned my Lean Six Sigma Black Belt. During my tenure there in production management, I crossed paths with Mark Haugen, who another strong lean thinker. He was the director for the Center for Excellence in Lean Enterprise at the Rochester Institute of Technology. I co-facilitated a rapid improvement event with Mark. And shortly after that, I joined his team at the Center for Excellence in Lean Enterprise at RIT, where I was a senior program manager, did a lot of consultation and training work in Lean Six Sigma, trained green belts and black belts, helped coach them through certification in their projects. Also did a lot of outreach work in manufacturing in upstate New York. So after that, I started consulting on my own. Mm-hmm. I started Chapman Lean Enterprise, where I did more consulting work. again, mostly in manufacturing, but also started to venture into healthcare and apply some lean thinking there. And then during that time, I also worked as the director for the Western New York Consortium for AME, the Association for Manufacturing Excellence. And then here in the last few years, I focused my energy more in healthcare with the Lean Consulting Group based at Purdue University. And now I'm back to consulting independently.
And I'm glad when we first connected that you very quickly drew in Val for your expertise and your background. If you can introduce yourself to the listeners, your academic background and about the work that you do.
Sure. So I've been doing diversity and inclusion for probably half my life, which means I started, I don't know, when I was 15, not really. But so no, I think as at least an undergraduate in college is when I really started thinking about the difference that it makes to have people from various backgrounds working together for a shared goal, right? And so that's kind of how I understand what diversity contributes to outcomes. And then we can add in both inclusion and equity, of course, which we'll talk about as the time goes forward. But so I've been doing this work for a long time. What I'm doing right now is I'm a university professor at Purdue, and I teach political science courses. I study minority political representation. But what I'm really interested even there is diversity, how diversity works in institutions, right? And so the work that I do, though, in consulting is really to transform spaces. So in one way, I'll work with undergraduate populations, graduate populations. I try to create spaces where people feel comfortable, try to insist on inclusion as a means of bringing people together and of making people feel whole. When people feel whole, they can contribute. When people can contribute, they can help to transform. And we can make space for everyone at the same table. And there's plenty of room. And so that's the kind of approach that I take. Now I work with people who are doing, I'm trying to diversify STEM fields. We're really paying attention to increasing the number and share of women and women of color in particular in fields that are largely white and largely male. And that has important implications for who comes behind them, right? So if we don't have role models, if we don't have accessibility, it has implications for that, but it also has implications for the kinds of problems that we're going to solve. If we don't bring the people to the table, then they can't contribute. So,
and as we'll talk about later, I mean, there's a really special opportunity for the two of you to combine your different experiences professionally. When you talk about transforming organizations, we use that word with Lean, at least as a goal. When we talk about respect for people, I can think about, being inclusive, respecting people, in particular, like not worrying about degrees or formal rank or position within an organization, of being more respectful and inclusive. But we can build upon that. So, I was wondering, Val, first off, in terms of definitions, in a nutshell, for those of us who are still learning what's really meant by these different terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, would you mind giving us just a quick synopsis
sure.
of in those terms and
sure. So when we think about diversity, one of the ways that I characterize it is it's often visible. That's not the only way that you're going to experience diversity. But diversity is often a visible signal. That is something that you see. So people are looking different than the way that they've looked before. But it's also, there are hidden diversities, right? So we can think about illnesses that people might have that might not be immediately visible, but they also bring a diverse kind of perspective or experience to the table when we're interacting with each other. We can certainly think of ways that we might have a mistaken identity where something looks one way, but it's actually something else, where maybe we don't know what racial background a person has and we make some assumptions, or maybe we don't even know what gender a person has and we make some assumptions. And so there are many ways that we can bring diversity to the table, but often the biggest cue, I think, is a visible one. And it matters to people. They need to be able to see it. But it also can cause some contention. It's not always easy. Okay, so that's the diversity piece of it. Inclusion, what I often tell people is, boy, you think diversity is hard, try inclusion, right? Because inclusion really means that people are able to bring their full selves to a space, that contribute, that there's a sense of belonging. So it is not just inviting people to the table, it is allowing them to make the menu, right? To set the table, to help determine who's invited, right? So when you have an inclusive space, you're bringing people in that can also make decisions, and you have hopefully meaningful engagement. Equity, I think, is really a question. It's where I think the impatience comes from, my goodness, we've been working on diversity for 30 years, 40, 50 years. We can go back as long as you want to go. But in the workplace, we've been doing that. And so how are you going to then move from systems where we have now more diversity? It looks different to us. We're working on inclusion, but it still doesn't seem just, right? Mm-hmm. So let's move beyond diversity and inclusion to something that is more equitable. That is, are people actually getting a fair share? Are we distributing resources appropriately and equitably, right? And so I think those are some of the differences that we're considering.
So we just expand a little bit on equity. I mean, there's a phrase that's been used for many decades now, equal opportunity, and there might be well-intended or even effective to some extent countermeasures to create equal opportunity. But then when you look at the results or the outcomes and you see, look, there is still a great inequity, mm-hmm. must be caused by something. That leads us deeper into the discussion around right. causes of equity, root causes, if you will.
Right.
Or inequity, causes of inequity.
Right. If I may, one of the things that we encounter, and Chris, you can chime in here, but certainly one of the things that we encounter is a debate about what's fair, right? So when you change a system, it will feel unfair to the people who've been privileged by it, right? It might even feel oppressive to them. And what we know about institutions is that they are designed to protect the status quo. So if you're going to move from an inequitable system to a more equitable one, then you're actually going to have to disrupt the status quo. It is necessary. And that means that the individuals who have been privileged are going to have to experience some discomfort. And mostly what we try to do, I think, is that we try to minimize the risk or the discomfort that comes with change by protecting the status quo. And that means that we don't really change much. And so what I say about Purdue, where we actually literally put a man on the moon, is if we can put a man on the moon, then surely this is a solvable problem, right? This is not dealing with equity and trying to move towards a more inclusive world and workplace cannot be more difficult than sending someone up through the atmosphere to land on a moon thousands of miles away.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, the moon problem, I mean, in a way, it comes down to a lot of math where societal, cultural issues are very complicated.
Right. Now,
but it's your point, is there a will, right? We had a will to put a man on the moon.
Is there will? Is there creativity? Is there ingenuity? Are we going to apply the resources that we need to do it? Are we actually going to be willing to live through the risk and through the failures in order to come out on the other side? And if I may, one of the things that I love about this lean work, it's not obvious, it wasn't obvious to me that it would fit, but it's so brilliant as an opportunity because it's a system, right? One of the things that I really like about the idea of this, it's like what I would like to see are systems that work regardless of who's sitting in the seat, right? And I think that lean practices actually provide us with a system that can work regardless of how people are feeling that day. It doesn't rely on goodwill. It relies on principles of people coming together, working in a dedicated fashion to improve over and over again and returning. And what I also really like about it is that you don't arrive at an end. Like one of the misconceptions that we've had, I think, about a lot of diversity training, that we come away saying, man, it doesn't work or it doesn't mean anything, is that there's not an immediate transformation, right? I've learned something new. I've learned about implicit bias. I've learned these things. But what happens next? And what we need are means to implement change with an understanding that it's constant, right? You're going to keep coming back to this because there's always room to make improvements. And so that's one of the things that I really am intrigued about with this enterprise.
Mm-hmm. And, when you talk about, finding a shared goal, I mean, it's easier for me to think about parallels in an organization. Let's say if there's a lean transformation and we're saying we're creating a culture where the people working in the shop floor are going to be heard. They're going to have a say. They're going to be making decisions that previously were made by managers. Sometimes managers feel a sense of loss. So, I mean, how do we find shared goals where some people feel like they are losing in the equations? Managers are losing control, or correct. I'll let you build upon this, but we think from a racial standpoint, if straight white males like myself feel a sense of loss, how can we be good allies working towards shared goals? Or how do we define a shared goal? What do you think?
Who, me?
Either of you or both.
Yeah, I think in lean we've long practiced really looking to our customer to help us define what our real purpose is, and so in trying to perfect that value stream or process by which we go about servicing that customer, and really becoming a bit more clear about what is it that the customer wants and how we go about providing that, whether it's a product or service. So I think as our customers become a bit more comfortable and courageous, perhaps, in clearly communicating to organizations what their expectations are around diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think most organizations will be forced to some extent to really grapple with, okay, how do we go about providing services not only efficiently and effectively as we traditionally look at it from a lean perspective, but how do we go about transforming that value stream to look more like our very diverse customer? And so I think as you hear more and more companies come out and CEOs and leaders say that, hey, part of our mission is to become a anti-racist organization. I think for lean thinkers and diversity, equity, and inclusion professionals, I think it presents a unique opportunity to come together and begin identifying those barriers for Black professionals and people of color that enter into those value streams with the intent of helping create value, for those organizations. Mm-hmm. So I'm excited about that aspect of it as I start to see more and more organizations, customers, step forward and say, hey, this is what we expect from organizations that provide products and services for us.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that that this moment is such a unique and striking moment. It's captured the attention of not only the nation, but the entire world. The entire world is responding to what we saw as a visual manifestation of disregard, right? At the very least, it's disregard that a Black man could die under the knee of a white police officer whose motto is to protect and to serve, right? So here we are in this moment where people can turn away, and it presents an opportunity to begin a difficult thing, right? And so how do we then come to shared goals, right? If we're going to do this big thing, if we're going to take this moonshot, then how do we come to a sense of shared goals? And one of the tensions, of course, is that well-meaning people are going to make mistakes. That's hard. That's a difficult way to feel in that moment. Like, I didn't mean to offend, or I wasn't intending it. This is being misinterpreted. Those things happen. But the issue, of course, is that they happen to people of color and women every day, right? This is a constant state of experience when you're marginalized, when you're operating on the margins, and where if there are not enough people who are like you in that space, where you're always auditioning, but you never actually belong, right? And so the work of transforming these spaces means now that we're actually going to share a little bit of that discomfort, and we're going to share a little bit of the risk, and we're going to reinterpret how we are engaging with one another. And again, to kind of think about your opening example, if you think about managers and how now we have to share something with, share power, share authority, share making some of these calls. I was thinking about it earlier, and again, what I really like about this approach is that it says that the experts are the people who are doing the work, right?
Right.
That they bring an expertise that the other people just simply do not have. And they bring a perspective on problem solving that the other people in the group may not have. So if we pull them together, right, then we're actually going to end up with a better outcome. And that is, again, another measure of diversity. So the diversity piece of it is already inherent in a lean systemic approach. And what's important about that is we know from literature, diversity brings a lot of challenges. I don't want to suggest to anybody that this is an easy road, right? But a lot of what we do that really matters and that's valuable to us is not necessarily the easy road, but the payoff is tremendous, right? So when you bring these diverse voices and experiences together, the thing that you can get can be remarkable. It can also be, you're going to have some errors along the way. There'll be some trial and some error. And I think that we have to devise systems that help us to walk through that. I think Chris said something to me the other day. It was about the process and not the people. You remember that?
Oh, yeah. It's what we lead by, right? We're hard on the process and not the people.
Right.
So I think that holds true here as well.
Yeah.
And thinking about systemic causes. But what you reminded me, and Chris, you mentioned Jim Womack earlier. And I'm reminded of something I've heard him say a lot when you talk about what's easy. Jim would often say, kind of disparagingly, but he'd say, well, leaders will try all sorts of things that are easy but don't work before they'll try something difficult that does work. And so maybe to explore out business, even to talk in terms of business outcomes, it's easier. Part of my reflection on what you're saying is that it's easier to surround ourselves with people who are very much like us. There's less risk of saying the wrong thing. There's less risk maybe of being challenged in different ways, right? So Silicon Valley companies talk a lot about the dysfunctional, what sometimes referred to as a tech bro culture. We're going to hire for fit. And then that leads to basically hiring people who went to the exact same schools, who look like you, who wear the same clothes, who use the same technology. And people in Silicon Valley, it's easier to diagnose the problem than it is maybe to come up with solutions. But those are just a couple of things that come to mind.
Homogeneity, right? That's what we're talking about. So seeing someone that looks like you don't have to, you're going to minimize the risk of harm to yourself. You're going to hopefully feel good because all day you're looking in the mirror, right? And so, wow, don't I look great, right? And so, but the issue is that your customer, your client, the world that you're surrounded with, that is not the world that they are in. I'll give you an example. and it is about cell phones. My thing is that if a woman invented the cell phone, first of all, it would have a hook at the top so I could hang it from a necklace, right? It wouldn't be something that I had to hook to a belt buckle that I don't have. There would be purses that were designed immediately so I could fit it in there with my credit cards, right? It would make a difference. I mean, you all know those stories way better than I do about how design is reflected about the people who are the designers. So when we do that, we're leaving out a whole segment of the population that could benefit. We do the same thing in healthcare. We do the same thing in education. We convince ourselves in our own echo chambers that this is the only way that it can be done, that we are not selecting on anything except for who is the best. But all of those things are path dependent on what has happened before them. And it matters who got admitted to those programs, who was deemed to be valuable, who was elevated, who was promoted. All of those things count. And I think now that in some ways it's a responsibility, it's also a business imperative, right, to do this and to really harness this moment to move into the next century, into the next season that we have both nationally and internationally.
Yeah. So Val, can you elaborate on that business case for diversity? Because it would be, it could be framed as a moral obligation, the right thing to do. We could have similar conversations about safety in a workplace, physical safety. But how do you help frame that as a business case and an imperative?
Well, I'm going to leave it to Chris to think about the safety part of it. That was some conversation that is very lean focused, right? Perfection, I think. But for me, if I got that right, but for me, the business case for diversity is this. So we went through a season, let's say coming out of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. We went through a season where the focus on kind of change was both about a business imperative, but also about goodwill, right? So if we're going to be good people and we're going to be good citizens, then this is the kind of work that we do. And I think that goodwill is helpful. Goodwill is helpful. But I'm not sure that it is either necessary nor is it sufficient. So let me clarify. Goodwill is important, right? So I'm not throwing it out the window. But if we rely on goodwill, then when times get hard, think about this moment now. We're in the middle of a viral pandemic and also social, racial unrest and concern. And so what will be sacrificed in this moment? Is it the sincere efforts and resources that were dedicated to diversifying our workplaces and our universities and our schools? The crisis is exactly the moment when you should not sacrifice those other things. Sure. Because if you do, the costs are so high. If you already have a gap, then you're only going to exacerbate it by putting it on the shelf in crisis. And in fact, the people who are going to suffer have already been suffering. So you're going to disadvantage people who have already been disadvantaged and then come back later and say, well, you have the same opportunity as anybody else, right? And that is your kind of, to go back to your earlier comment about equality and equity, right? And so the business case for diversity actually says that it is focused on the bottom line of business goals, but it's also about, and it's not only about bringing in people of color to work with other people of color, or bringing in women to work with the women in an organization or in the clients or the customers. It's actually much more than that. When you bring together diverse teams with people who have different racial or ethnic background, different gender experiences, different even regional experiences, they're going to bring also different experiences of work. They're going to have eyes that see clients differently. There's a great Harvard Business Review article. It's probably from sometime in the 1990s, I think. I wish I had it right in front of me. But that it talks about this business case for diversity, and it is lovely in that it says that when you bring together a diverse team, you actually are going to multiply the kind of outcomes that you get far more than would happen if it was a homogenous team that typically is seeing the world all the same way, right?
Yeah, and I think we see that similar kind of results when we think about pulling together cross-functional teams for Kaizen events. And so when you have that cross-functional team that's made up of folks from the shop floor that are on the front lines of doing the work, when you may have supervisors or environmental health and safety folks that are part of the team, they're all looking at the same problem from different perspectives. And it's not just the implementation of the countermeasure, but you have to think about the sustainability over the long term. And what I've found, I'm sure you've seen this as well, Mark, that when folks are involved in making that change, they're a bit more on board to help sustain it over time. They don't feel like it's being done to them, but they were a part of making that change. And so I think that goes a long way as well as we start to create more diverse teams with their own unique perspectives and problem solving.
So maybe let's go back a little bit. There was a word used earlier that merits some definition and exploration. The idea of anti-racism or anti-racist. First off, what is that?
Do you want to talk about this or me?
You can speak to it.
Oh, okay. Anti-racism is a way of approaching change or transformation with an understanding that it is not enough to say, I personally am not a racist, right? That is good. That is a move in the right direction. It is directionally correct, to quote this man to my right. But it is not sufficient to the task to say, I am not racist, if the systems that we are embedded in are, right? And so anti-racism, or to be an anti-racist, means that you are taking an active role. When I am not racist, but the systems are, I pretend that is a neutral solution, but it actually maintains the status quo in a way that continues the disadvantages that racism presents. And so to be anti-racist says, we will take an active role in dismantling racist policies, racist procedures, racist, or let me rephrase that, because sometimes it's hard for people to hear the word racist. Policies and procedures that consistently disadvantage some and advantage others, right? That is one way to think about it. And so when that happens, in my field, we typically would call that a discriminatory effect, right? Some are advantaged, some are disadvantaged. When that is consistent in terms of the outcomes that we see, and we can't just have one or two outliers, that's not sufficient for this, then we actually need to dismantle that particular policy, investigate it. Why is it like that? What is it doing? What purpose does it serve? How can we make it so that the outcomes are actually more equitable? I think that's about anti-racism, but you probably have some ideas too.
Yeah, and I would just add what I think is really exciting part of kind of joining forces with diversity, equity, and inclusion with lean management systems is that we traditionally look at that value stream and really look at the process by which we go by to service customers. And when you start to look at it from the standpoint of Black professionals and people of color kind of entering that value stream, and as lean thinkers, we can define that value stream, from start to finish. In healthcare, it's from admissions to discharge, and looking at every step in between. So when we start looking at value streams from the pathway of that professional, from recruitment to onboarding to promotions, that first, second, third promotion as they're working their way up the ladder, we're identifying those barriers to their flow, if you will. We're typically looking at the flow of, patients or products or services, but we can also use our lean thinking to look at the flow of Black professionals and people of color. and begin to really do a deeper dive in to better understand what those barriers are, what those opportunities for improvement are. And we can start to leverage not just the leadership, but the staff and Black professionals and people of color that have been negatively impacted by those barriers. So I think our way of looking at the system and the value stream provides some unique opportunities when we think about dismantling racism, to really use some of these tools that we've used in the past, that are proven, that we know work effectively. We can begin to unpack and dismantle racism in a similar way.
And I was going to say, I'm the first to admit that I am very late to this cause. And I think one thing that's been, an awakening for me recently is like as you wrote about, Chris, and as you were saying, Val, it's not enough to be neutral. Can't be Switzerland in this. Right. And it's not enough to say, well, I don't say overtly racist things. Mm-hmm. I've been taught or I've learned that's bad. Don't do that. To not, I could say, well, I don't do overtly racist things. But recently, I'm drawn to look at, there are clearly systemic problems that clearly affect others, and I'm trying to be more empathetic to that. Not be, I can afford to say, I don't want to think about systemic racism today.
Right.
You might not have that privilege. I mean, I use that word intentionally. I have the privilege to say, well, I might be benefiting from it, but it's not my fault. That doesn't make it right.
Right. Right. I mean, I think it's incumbent upon, that's where diverse teams actually come together, right? That is where talking to people who are different from you, but more than that, honestly, this is about leadership. It is about saying that this is the direction we're going in. We're not going to debate it. There's not an alternative to it. And not only are we going to go in this direction, we succeed at doing it. And that is possible. That brings in will and resources and perspective and opportunity and commitment to these kinds of problems. And one of the issues is I'm a good person. So there's no, for someone to say this is racist, is that to say that you are not a good person, or this, John or Jane are not good people because this was racist, what I experienced was racist? And it doesn't have to impugn your character. That's one of the ways that we deflect what is actually happening, is that we say, how dare you, right? Call me a racist. Mm-hmm. And the issue is, I don't have to call you a racist, but I can say that this thing that you did is racist. There is a scholar and activist who talks about it. His name is Jay Smooth, and his issue is, if you take my wallet, like, we don't have to debate about whether you took my wallet. It feels bad to me if you took my wallet, right? Regardless of what your intent was. And so if this thing that you did is racist, I don't know whether you're a good person or not. Perhaps you are. But even larger than that, right? Even larger than that, our individual interactions, which is where we're typically going to go. We need to be thinking about how things play out at a macro level, right? So then some of it is interpersonal, but if we are going to change outcomes, if we're going to transform workplaces, then we actually need to be thinking about the policies that create the outcomes that we see. And that is the place that we need to tackle. And the truth of the matter is that sometimes the people who we're dealing with, who are experiencing it, may not be able to envision as grand a goal as we need to actually transform it. But they need to be involved in the conversations related to it. There are others that will also come into the room to say, hey, we can push this even further. And I think I hope that is the moonshot moment that we're in right now, that we're really trying to push things further. And it's about policy change.
Yeah. Now I would piggyback on that. Val mentioned it's about leadership. I would take it a step further and say it reflects the level of leadership within an organization. Not any different, in my view, than if you walked into a factory that had, injuries through the roof, and it was unsafe work practices, had all sorts of OSHA violations. They were contaminating, local water systems. That's a reflection of leadership, and I think lack of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Awesome.
You would also consider that a lack of leadership.
Yeah.
I mean, what I love about that example, Chris, is that we also would see then a spillover into communities, right?
Right.
We would see a spillover into people's personal lives.
Right.
Because we have let this kind of languish and fester. And now we see all of these outcomes that we see in schools or in neighborhoods or communities that are evidence of these kinds of policies in workplaces, right? Or in higher education.
Right. And I think it was Jim Womack that said in his newsletter that if you help the worker, you in turn help that worker's family, you in turn help the community, you in turn help society.
Right.
So this is important work that needs to be done.
Right.
One parallel maybe to explore for a second, we're talking about leadership and environments, and Chris, you and I have this mid-90s General Motors, probably some pretty shared experience. And I think back, not in the context of racism, but working for leaders who were kind of that classic yelling and screaming, blame the workers for everything that was quite clearly a systemic quality problem. Yell and spit and scream and swear, and in first year and a half of the 2 years I was at General Motors, and I still have thoughts to say, like, well, that leader, he was a bad person. Look at the way he was behaving. That must be evidence of bad character, and he's disrespectful of people. I was out with a group of friends one night out to dinner at some restaurant, and I looked across and I was appalled, and there was that guy. I'm like, oh no, he's invading my personal life. He was, apparently out to dinner with family, multi-generations. And I'm like, this guy seems pretty beloved out here in a social setting. And he actually turned a round of drinks over. And I'm like, okay, I'll see you Monday. Take more abuse. But the thought or the parallel, the reason I'm sort of detouring down memory lane there is, I think over time, I've come to understand that his behavior was the product of a system, that General Motors organizational culture that he was swimming in for 35 years. And so as I've been trying to read and understand systemic racism, there seem to be parallels where instead of labeling, well, good people aren't racist, bad people are racist, we are all swimming in a culture that we've been raised in. And I don't want to, correct me here. I mean, this probably isn't the right way to say it, but say like, well, that behavior is not their fault. They're the product of a system. Like, to what extent is that true when it comes to things like racial bias or prejudice?
I think it's on the money. I think I would tweak it just a bit to say that this is not a system necessarily that you created, but if it is one that you benefit from, then you have a responsibility to open it up, right? And so I think that then the blame and the fault, they're less relevant to actually the goal, the intention of changing it, right? With a clear objective at the end of it. And that is that we should see something different at the end than where we started. And some of that is going to be measured in diversity. Some of it hopefully will be measured in inclusion. And then we ought to also see more equitable outcomes. And if we can work through those things, then we are moving certainly on the right path. And so yeah, I think it is, some people are not really good people, right? So we also need to recognize that. But the issue is that we should not, in order to make these changes happen, I think we need to devise approaches that both require some self-reflection, but don't rely only on self-reflection. The example I give is the question, how many of us are still using transparencies and overhead? None, right? In part because you can't find the transparency paper in my front office anymore. And I think they removed the overhead projectors from the classrooms, right? And so there are ways that we are nudged and moved to take certain kinds of steps. And organizations, workplaces, classrooms, departments, that's the kind of work that I think that we need to do. I don't know, Chris, did you have something on that?
Yeah, I think, again, it goes back to leadership. In the work that we do, we realize that if leadership isn't on board, if they don't have a vision and mission for continuous improvement, then you might have some successes here and there, but you typically won't sustain it. So leadership's got a key role to play. Certainly the kind of cadence that you establish in cycling through plan, do, check, act of the kind of transformation that lean thinkers are accustomed to reviewing on a regular basis, looking at those A3s, ensuring that, we ran that experiment, this corrective action to address this particular problem, this is the improvement, this is what we learned, and then, kind of scanning the entire organization for opportunities to spread those lessons learned. That's a reflection of leadership. And that doesn't happen without leadership. So diversity, I think, falls into a similar kind of category, that leadership will be key in making that successful.
Well, and let me just add one more thing, and that is that in the case of the really angry, I haven't worked in a workplace like a shop floor. I'm thankful, because you guys tell some horror stories that, frankly, to me on the outside, they're mildly entertaining. I'll just say that. Like, I'm amazed at that. But I think one of the points is that you might not be able to change that person's kind of their approach, right? Maybe you can help them to talk a little more quietly, but you might not change their hearts or their minds. But there do have to be consequences for behavior and for choices and for decisions that go against this new goal that we're setting. And that, I think, is part of leadership, but it's also part of devising new policies and new approaches that actually give you the outcome that you want. Again, that's why I use PowerPoint and not transparencies. That's why I teach online now, right? I'm learning a whole new skill set because of the demand that's in front of me. And that I think is the moment that we're in.
Yeah, and I would just piggyback on that. In the lean community, we say no problem is a problem. And so as leaders in organizations, if you're thinking, hey, I'm not racist, we have all good people here, then that's probably a reflection of a significant blind spot that we need to take a second look at.
So, when it comes to leadership, Chris, you're being a leader in, stepping forward and taking, in some ways, what might be a risk in writing, there's now 2 articles for the Lean Enterprise Institute to bring up issues that are going to be uncomfortable to people, myself included. To be honest, I'm trying to, it's uncomfortable to look at what happens to people. And as you're saying, no problem is a problem. Let's say if somebody were to come to a plant manager in their corner office who never goes to the shop floor, again, I'm thinking 25 years ago, to say, there's a big safety problem out here. It would be easy for the plant manager to say, no, there isn't. And, I think in the analogy, it's in my head, I am that plant manager. If somebody were to come and say, I'm being treated unfairly and unjustly because of the color of my skin, I'm in no position to say, no, I don't see that happening. Mm-hmm. So can you kind of elaborate on, the things in society or even personally that sort of led you to come forward and write this and continue writing and sort of trying to rally lean thinkers around this, Chris?
Yeah, sure. I would say a few things happened. Late last year, professionally, I found myself on the receiving end of some racist, what I would describe as discriminatory actions. And I found myself walking away from that incident, and I won't get into a lot of detail here, But I will say that part of my motivation to writing these articles were both personal. Had experienced some discriminatory actions where I walked away from the experience feeling like really scratching my head to some extent, because a white manager at this particular organization had exercised what I consider to be just an overwhelming use of force and power to address a matter that I was involved in, but he didn't bother to have a discussion with me about it. That he had prejudged me and then gone from 0 to -60 in in a matter of moments, and when I escalated the matter to upper management, who were also 2 white males, they turned a blind eye to it. And so I was kind of grappling with my own personal experience with racism in the workplace. And then the Ahmaud Arbery situation unfolded. The deadly encounter, an incident happened. And then there was Breonna Taylor, and then ultimately George Floyd. And I think, like most Americans and citizens around the world, that just made me really stop. And, it felt like a punch in the face and a knee in the gut. And just really started to question, obviously, that's not the America we want to live in. It doesn't reflect our greater values. And I think, like most people, I was questioning, hey, what could I do to make this a better place? And so since 2001, I've been writing articles, lean articles. So that's something I already did. I also write to kind of unpack and sort out my own personal feelings. So it's a bit therapeutic for me. So, and I think once I saw the newsletter from LEI, basically stating that, they were going to do some self-reflection and aim to do what they could to dismantle racism once and for all, I thought, you know what, I'm going to make that pledge as well. And so I started to write. Val and I started to talk a bit more. And, we thought that, hey, we can do something here. We can make a difference using lean and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that's really how it came about.
Can I add to that just a little? It wasn't my experience. Chris probably like, what is she going to say? But just to see that moment and the kind of ripple effects it has across a family. But as someone who does diversity and inclusion work, it really, in Chris's case, it matters who is given the benefit of the doubt. Who's given the benefit of the doubt? Who can make a mistake or have a chance to have a conversation about something that might be misinterpreted? And that is deeply related to power, right? And then value. So whose perspective or experience is valued in a space is also deeply related to power. And it can be highly correlated with the race of the color of a person's skin, their sex, their gender. All of these things can have an impact on how valued they are, how credible they are viewed to be, whether or not they are given the benefit of the doubt, who is responsible, right? Who I need to trust, who I need to support in this. Is it happenstance that all of the people that Chris was working for were white men, right? That's not. The odds are randomly, we ought to at least see outcomes that reflect the percentages that we have in the population. If we're not seeing that, then it is not random. And something has actually moved in a way to advantage some and disadvantage others. And I think the other thing is, what was interesting there is a question of whose responsibility even in this, I think you're right that when a person of color actually comes forward to voice this, they are climbing over a bunch of barriers to say aloud what they have been contending with for a long time. Mm-hmm. And that also needs to be valued and respected. And there are lots of ways to approach things. It doesn't mean that every case, every incident, this person is always right. It doesn't mean that. Right. But it does mean that we need to take seriously and hear what is coming to us as leaders in organizations, so that we can end up with outcomes that are an improvement over where we are. What we don't want is for people to be falling into the streets again in 5 years, right? We want to at least be moving forward, right? And not standing still, right. I think.
And in my personal situation, I didn't feel heard. And certainly as I looked around for allies,
right,
they just weren't present. And so again, obviously that's not the sort of place I want to do business with. I'm no longer there. Mm-hmm. But if I can utilize my skill set to help improve the processes again and the policies that would allow something like that to happen, then I'm on board and I want to be involved.
Well, and one more thing, those blind spots are costly.
Absolutely.
They're costly. So what you lose in those moments is talent. If you're in a talent war, they have lost the talent that you provide, the perspective, the innovation, the experience that you bring to the table, all over a kind of a power move that went unchecked. And that, I think, is what, if we go back to the business case for diversity, that is part of it. And again, one of the things that I think is really important about doing kind of thinking through lean is that we do a lot of training. There's a lot of diversity training. It is important. There are ways that we need to see the world differently before we can take action, right? So you need to do some self-reflection first. Mm-hmm. But how do we actually implement change? How can we pay attention to it? How can we measure it? I think that lean tools or lean practices are some of the ways that we can do that.
And for lean thinkers, we can relate to that as well, right? Many of us started out in lean where the focus was on training and getting folks certified, green belt, black belt, lean leaders, lean experts, and only to find out that, hey, there was some initial success, if you were implementing, corrective actions and kaizens and the like, but you weren't able to sustain it. And then through plan, do, check, act, you realize that, hey, we've got to do something more here. We need to establish more of an operating system by which we're going to run the business and make continuous improvement part of how we operate. And so I think diversity experts are finding a similar kind of
there's an impatience
lesson there that there's more needed.
I think some of the dots I would connect when you talk about the training thing, like I go into a hospital, there's a bias from the leaders in power that often unsaid that the problem is the workers. So therefore, we're going to send the frontline healthcare workers to this lean training to make them lean. And then the executive shows up, says something for 40 seconds to kick off the session, and then out of the room. And I don't ever understand the hypothesis of where giving a lot of lean training, which isn't bad, but probably insufficient, how is that going to change the systems that, going back to Dr. Deming, would say, senior leaders are responsible for the systems, and systems drive behavior. The Shingo Institute and in those lean models would say that systems drive results. And I can see where there's a parallel of like, well, we're going to train our employees to not be racist. Does that really?
Right. What I love is the conversation that Chris had recently about safety, and I thought, this is crazy. Like, we're not going to have any. What was it? No safety problems. The story that you told me recently, like we're going to go down to zero. You're going to go down to zero accidents, right? And I thought, that's ridiculous. Like, how can you do that? It is such an audacious goal.
Yeah. I mean, habitual excellence. It was the post that.
Yeah.
But if you're just lecturing people to not get hurt, that's not going to be effective.
Right.
Pressuring people to stop reporting safety problems, just like we wouldn't want people to stop reporting instances of discrimination.
Right.
Just to hit a zero discrimination reports target.
Right.
We've got to lead, like you're saying, it comes down to leadership.
Right. And I actually think that you said something really important, that it shouldn't always be the people of color that have to raise these issues. In fact, the most important people to raise some of these issues, even at risk of getting it wrong, are the white allies in the room, men and women in the room who can say, wait a minute, I think that what I just saw is problematic. It's racist, or it's sexist, or it is homophobic, right? And so those are the safest voices in the room. So we shouldn't always rely on the most vulnerable people to bring our attention to the thing that is actually that has made them feel unsafe or more vulnerable in a space. And I think too that it is really important that the notion of people kind of hiding or putting things aside to protect themselves, that does require leadership to say, these are the things I want you to bring to my attention. I want you to bring these to my attention so we can actually change them, because we don't want it to look better. We want it to be better. And I think that's where we're headed.
And I think we can learn from Toyota in that regard as well, as they think about identifying waste. It's not something to hide, right?
Right.
It's actually, to some extent, reason for, certainly not with racism, that you would celebrate identifying this opportunity for improvement, but it is just that, an opportunity to improve. So I think when you look at it that way, it's a positive, not a negative.
Well, to be aware, I think to be aware, and to the thing is, we're not looking for the race police or the sexism police like that. It's hard for anyone to live in an environment where everything is, a minefield, right? So I don't think that that's what we're looking for. We're not looking to be in a space. Again, this is one of the things I like about Lean, because you're really looking at processes and you're bringing people along. Now, if the people that you're bringing along can't contribute or refuse to do the work, then that is a different set of issues. But that means that you're not always walking on eggshells. You're really saying, hey, I'm here to learn. I'm going to make some mistakes. Let me try to figure this out. And that happens on all sides. As we learn how to as people who have typically not had voice or not had opportunity or who have been excluded, move into these spaces, they are going to make mistakes too, right? And so we need to have enough grace in these endeavors that we can persist to the other side. We do it with anything else. We do it with anything that we test, that we try, and that we make mistakes on. And I'll say this one more thing. If you go back to a hospital example, one of the things that I see sometimes in my meetings, not at hospitals, but I think about it in the same way, is the kind of deference that a nurse will have perhaps to a doctor or to some senior administrator. Now, the nurses are on the front line. They see exactly what's happening. They are also the most at risk, because if something goes wrong and it has something to do with them, they are out the door. The doctor gets to stay. The administrator gets to stay. So they are the most at risk of bringing something forward, the least powerful in the space. And now we're saying, hey, we're going to need for you to speak up. Tell me how that works, right? That is the process that we need to disrupt and shift. So in any case, and I see it in my own spaces, and I love it. I had a white colleague of mine. We were doing work recently in a college campus, and a dean started talking about what it meant to be a leader and all of these things. And it was really a deflection from the conversation we were having. And after we were done and we had a debrief, she called me on it, and she said, "You let him get away with it, right?" And I said to her, "I am so grateful that you have said this to me, because I need to be aware of the ways that I will be deferential to authority and to power as well." Right. And we all need allies that are willing to do that, because we're differently situated. I will say this one more thing, that none of us is without power, right? I don't think that any of us is without power. One of the ways that people sometimes enter into this diversity efforts is with pity, or with, shame for themselves, and now they want to go out and rescue somebody. That is not the enterprise that we're in. Again, if we go back to lean systems, this is not about feeling sorry for the guy that's working on whatever this machine is, right? Or for the engineer or for the mechanic. Like, we don't feel sorry for that person. We actually say, hey, we need to hear from you, because if we don't, we're not going to be able to actually solve this problem. So it's not a matter of saving. And it's also, we have to be careful about requiring or expecting people of color or women, and particularly women of color, to rescue. It is one of the ways that's in the back of our heads. I'm a university professor, and as a woman of color in that space, I often have students who and we see it in the data of evaluations, students who will criticize me because I'm not kind enough, right? Or because I'm not motherly enough in the classroom. They never expect that of their male teachers, and particularly of their white male teachers, right? Their professors, in that case, they expect them to be distant and exacting. But if I do that, then I'm actually, boy, there are all kinds of names that could come up, right, about what this professor is, but they're not kind, right? They're critical. And part of that is how I'm situated. It doesn't mean that I don't have power in that space, but I'm also evaluated differently. And I think that is another thing that we need to be able to take account as we move forward.
Let me ask, when we talk about the names and the moments that catch people's attention. George Floyd killed by the police. Breonna Taylor shot and killed by the police in Louisville. Ahmaud Arbery killed by white civilians when he was out jogging. And then there's, so when you talk about people abusing power, we can talk about the police abusing power, whether they're white police or otherwise. But then there's maybe this more insidious power. And I think that's where the case of Christian Cooper is an interesting one, because thankfully he was not killed. But it's a much more subtle situation. And correct me if I have any of this wrong, but he was in a park in New York. A black man, Christian Cooper, was there to do bird watching, right? And there was a white woman whose dog was not on a leash, and he said something, kind of called her on it, and she, it seems, retaliated by calling the police and lied and said a black man was threatening her.
Right.
So can you share some perspectives on why that was perhaps such a dangerous thing for that white woman to do?
Yeah, let me start, and then maybe Chris can chime in. And part of what happened in that moment is that Christian Cooper is not only a bird watcher, he is on the bird watching, like, I'm blanking on the word, but he is on this. He's a leader in
ornithology.
Ornithological. I love it, because we lived in upstate New York, and that Cornell has an ornithological center at Cornell University. But yes, so he is a leader in this group, and he was there bird watching in the early morning, and dogs are supposed to be on leashes, and her dog was not. And
he points out the sign that's put.
Right. Well, and part of it is that it is important that dogs be on leashes, because there are all of these various species of birds in this park, in this part of Central Park, and dogs have a tendency to run them out and dogs have a tendency to run the birds out of those spaces. And so he's really trying to be protective. He doesn't want them under the bush. So here, what I see in this dynamic is a person out of place. So let me, if I may, just a few minutes, is that for Amy Cooper, Christian Cooper, no relation, of course, is a man who's out of place. Right, in multiple kinds of ways. First, he's a bird watcher. A black man is a bird watcher, really, right? The second way that he's out of place is that he speaks with authority to her. He has it. He speaks with authority. What is this? Who are you? How are you speaking to me about this? Maybe she did feel threatened, but it was in a way that is really because this situation is unfamiliar. And when I see you, I think that you're supposed to do what I say, not the other way around, right? So for Amy Cooper, then she says, if you don't leave me alone, this is not her words, this is me paraphrasing, I am going to call the police, and you know what that means. And that is an exercise of privilege, right? That becomes the kind of insidious and implicit threat that Christian Cooper is supposed to understand and step back from, right? I will scream. I will call the police. I will be believed and you will not. And this is over whether or not she should put her dog on the leash. And what it comes down to is who has the authority to speak with confidence in this interaction. And for her, it was clearly not Chris Cooper. And she was willing to actually put him at risk, recognizing that in anger, right? It was a moment of anger. Now, if you fast forward, Chris Cooper said, so Amy Cooper paid a high price for it. Even going as far as to lose her dog, but she lost her job. She was spread across all these newspaper pages. But Chris Cooper says at the end that he feels like there is something much bigger than merely Amy Cooper here. And so in order to get to that much bigger issue, he doesn't want to only make an example of her. Like, it's not over when Amy Cooper is prosecuted or when Amy Cooper loses her job, because it's not only about Amy Cooper. It's about how people move through spaces, who they can hear, how they can understand it, who can exercise authority and power. And that's part of what we're confronting. And those are the kind of the big and small ways that we're going to have to deal with navigating this new kind of reality that we're in.
Yeah, and I think it does reflect her beliefs that I'm superior to Chris Cooper. How dare he, tell me to put my dog on a leash? So I think it does really reflect the ugliness of her beliefs about who's superior in that situation. And he was clearly, from her perspective, out of line. And she was willing to call the police and fabricate some story of being in danger to put him back in his place, which she saw as inferior to herself. So,
but it's not unusual. There was a story recently in Indianapolis of a Black man who was at the pool in his complex, but it's a high-end complex. We see these stories all the time. Do you belong here?
Right.
Do you belong here?
Trayvon Martin.
Yeah, right.
In a
but
gated community.
Yes, in a gated community that his father lived in. Do you belong here? I don't know you, so you can't possibly belong here. You are an outlier. Those kinds of experiences are so insidious. And Chris and I we have 2 Black sons. We have to help them navigate a world where people will wonder, perhaps, do you belong here? And what we tell them is that the world is where you belong. You can go anywhere in the world that you want to be. But we also know that you are going to experience this differently than some of your friends do, right? And so you're going to have to learn this early. And for me, I wonder personally, like when my son walks down the street, do people wave at him? Do they treat him like a 14-year-old? Because he's a kid, right? And I like to think that they do in our neighborhood. I do. I really do. I think we have genuinely great neighbors. But what I'm saying is, what are the subtle ways that he experiences being different, but only or primarily because he's Black and he's male? And by definition, then, is threatening. There's a really important book called Whistling Vivaldi, right? And it tells a story of a graduate student at Northwestern, I think, or University of Chicago, and how a Black male, and how he'd be walking down the street, and white women would grab their purses, or they might cross the street, or they might get quiet. And so, and this is in Chicago. So he started whistling classical music. He started whistling Vivaldi. And when he started whistling Vivaldi, people began to smile at him instead of trying to distance from him. And this was the work that he had to do
Mm.
in order to reassure people that he was quote unquote safe. So even upon seeing him without knowing anything about him, and that is part of what I see with Amy Cooper. She could not know that Christian Cooper was who he was. She didn't know it, but she didn't even bother to imagine that it was possible. And that's part of
and so I mean it. You know, I there are some people listening. You know, you said earlier some people don't like hearing the word racist.
Mm-hmm.
I know there are white listeners, if after more than an hour they're still listening, maybe not, but people are still going to cringe at a phrase like white privilege
Mm-hmm.
and get defensive and push back on that. But what you're describing, let me frame it in terms of waste. Here's maybe my reflection, is that I do not spend one moment of any day worrying about are people looking at me like I don't belong.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have, I'll frame it in terms of the waste of time I'm not spending about that is time I can spend on productive endeavors, frankly, right? So, I mean, you think of it as a tax on people's time that I don't pay.
Right.
Because I'm not having to think about that or guard against that or put defensive measures in place. I get to just be myself and I get along just fine.
Right.
And so that's where it's hard to hear the stories of someone else's reality.
Mm-hmm.
And all I can do is just try to listen to that and be empathetic to it. And then we can start thinking about what can we do to start creating better organizations in more just societies. Like you use the word gap, Val, and so we use that word a lot, Chris and others in Lean. We talk about identifying a gap, identifying a problem. How do you ask what do we want the country to be? That's defining an ideal state, or at least a future state. We might not get to perfection, but we're going to work toward it, and we've got to understand causes. We've got to try to come up with some countermeasures and actions. What can we do? So maybe maybe that brings us to kind of a closing discussion of, again, combining your backgrounds and experiences and expertise, Chris and Val, lean management systems, diversity, equity, and inclusion, how to combine approaches to come up with, as you already addressed, more than just training. What are some actions or recommendations that can help move things forward?
Well, I think, and Val and I, when we thought about this, one thing that came to mind for me back when I was at RIT, we were working with a group of environmental health and safety specialists to create a toolkit for lean and environmental toolkit for the EPA. And that was something that obviously lean thinkers and lean practitioners couldn't do alone. So we partnered with environmental health and safety professionals to help us identify, those opportunities for improvement, to not only identify, waste from a lean perspective to improve flow of value streams and such, but to also identify those environmental and energy types of waste. And so I think we have a similar opportunity here to partner with professionals like Valeria here that have, spent careers looking at race and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Lean thinkers like myself have spent a lot of time looking at value streams and engaging leaders and workforces to transform their business environments. So I think there's a wonderful opportunity here to begin looking at that value stream together. So as we look at the entry, from recruitment through the entire pathway of the journey of an employee, paying particular attention to the underrepresented and understand how they flow through that process, and having a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert also look at that to help us identify, those barriers. We know how to go about measuring, its impact on, employees or patients or products. I think we can do a similar thing here as we compare, the flow through that value stream. When we look at Black professionals as well as people of color compared to white colleagues flowing through the same process, and better understand those disparities, what some of the barriers are that we can remove and dismantle to create a more equitable and fair and just experience and pathway for those. And so I think Dr. D'Angelo, the author of White Fragility, described kind of the Black experience as one like swimming against the current, and the white person, having challenges, no doubt, but swimming with the current.
Right.
And so as we begin to take a closer look at those value streams that we're all, a part of, I think we can begin to identify those opportunities and pull very diverse cross-functional teams together to help identify, problem solve, identify root causes, and implement countermeasures that will create this more fair and just kind of work environment.
If I can, I agree. I guess I want to go back to the business case, right? Because a lot of this sounds like goodwill, like justice and equity. Like these are big terms, fairness, and they are important, no doubt. But this also affects your bottom line. So one of the things that I was thinking about as you all were talking is disparities in infant mortality, for instance, or disparities in maternal death rates, right? And so, or disparities in the time of COVID-19. How is it that these things are happening, that we see racial and ethnic and class disparities in who lives and who dies? And that is about the ways that our healthcare system operates. And so what if it made sense to bring people in to diversify those teams that are making decisions so that we can remove some of the blind spots? Part of it is that when you have a more diverse team, they are going to be looking for and seeing other things, right? I think one of the most important books for Lean is Learning to See. I think that's an important kind of thing. We all need. I don't know anything about Lean, let me tell you. Well, I know a lot more about Lean than I probably should, but not enough, right? Because I've been hearing about it for 20 years.
That's part of the learning process. So I'm learning more about diversity and inclusion.
Right.
I'm learning more about Lean.
So I've been hearing snippets for 30 years or something like that. And so, but certainly, this business case, that hits at your bottom line. What kinds of outcomes do you actually want to see? And what you want to see is improved outcomes for populations that have been more than disadvantaged, but are certainly are actually experiencing less than the quality that we would expect. That your other clients, some clients get really good service and other clients apparently don't. Right. What can we do to right that ship? And I think that diversity and equity, and as importantly, inclusion will help us get there. And I think we'll see it, we can see that in classrooms, hospitals, and other kinds of decision making. So
I think more of the customers just demanding it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let me ask one other question. It comes to mind, and while we're on this topic, I've got to ask it because I'm sure I want to hear your thoughts, Chris, as a consultant in this space, and Val, your thoughts in terms of, like, if you're advising an organization in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm not speaking on behalf of any of the major lean conferences, but as an attendee and as somebody who has spoken at these conferences, it is hard not to notice that if 13% of Americans are Black, you don't see 13% Black faces on stage speaking. You don't see 51% women on stage. So defining that gap, that inequity, is easier than like the rest of the thought process of how to and how aggressively or what actions can and should be taken to look into that clear gap. I don't know what to do beyond identifying the gap.
Right. I can jump in here.
Please.
Part of it, I think, is who is elevated, who is trained, who is called to the front. So I think in those spaces, where we will begin is with perhaps one or two, right? We'll begin with one or two, and they will be tokens, and they will probably feel like tokens, right? And so there's a lot of pressure on a token. Does that make sense? That is the one kind of representative, so I can't make a mistake, right? If I get out there, then I represent everybody that's going to come behind me, and if I make a mistake, there's not going to be another chance. Yes.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's part of the privilege I have is that if I go up there and I stink as a speaker, people are going to say Mark was a bad speaker. It doesn't reflect on, well, it was a mistake to invite white men to speak.
Right. Exactly.
So and that doesn't occur to me. That's my blind spot.
Right.
So thank you for sharing that perspective.
Right.
Go
well, but so what I'm saying is, so one of the ways that we think about getting around some of that is we do things in cohorts, right? You when we hire in the academy, you bring in a set of people instead of just one person. When you bring in speakers, maybe you bring in a set of speakers. You give them opportunities to practice, to talk with each other. You make sure that they have mentors. You make sure that they have coaching. You invest in them for the long haul, right? You become a sponsor and a supporter, an ally, a coach. And I think, too, that one of the other things that we see in literature, in the scholarship on this, is that when there are more than one woman in a diverse team, that women are more likely to speak. The more isolated a woman is, the more quiet she is likely to be. And so we can see similar kinds of outcomes with people of color. It's not always the case. There are some times when a singular individual can rise to the top and be very outspoken. So these things are not prescriptive, but they are observational. We can see those kinds of things in observation. So how do you change that? Well, you need to have internships, and you need to make sure that you don't fire your intern because they're 5 minutes late or because of whatever. That means that you're having conversations with this person about what it means to do this and what it means to try. That means when people are quiet, you ask them to speak up and you encourage them and you give them a chance to make a mistake, and the mistake is not deadly. That is one of the privileges of white malehood. It's not for everybody. There are white men who make a deadly mistake at the beginning. And here I know I'm using the term deadly, but I mean career-wise, right? Not physically.
Reputation-wise. Yeah.
Right. And so I think that's part of it. When in one of my previous positions, I felt like there was an unspoken rule. So sometimes people would share things with me. I wouldn't know that I shouldn't repeat them. I thought, if you're telling me, I should tell everybody. It's my personality, not a secret, but a strategy, right? So how do you get a promotion where you go on the job market, right? So, you establish your value out on the job market, and then somebody here will say, you're great, and we're going to want to keep you. So we create competition. Well, I repeated this to other people. I didn't know that I shouldn't have, because it was really private. But that person never came to me to say anything to me. They just stopped talking to me. It was so perplexing that I didn't understand what happened for years, right? So one of the things that I say, we do this workshop on building inclusive research environments. It's called Irie, which I kind of like because it's kind of, funky Caribbean. But and when you're building an inclusive research environment, one of the things that you have to do is make implicit norms explicit, right? So if there are things that you are doing quietly, that you would have conversations with someone over coffee or what have you, I'm not saying all of that goes away, but you got to make those things more explicit. What are the norms of my lab? What are the norms of my office? What are the norms of the department? You have to pull sometimes people aside and not say, well, they should have known. Instead, you say, I don't know if you were aware of this, right? And you help people to navigate, because part of the reason why some people are perpetually privileged is that they have knowledge of the inside game. And if you don't have knowledge of the inside game, then what you really think is, boy, if I just work harder and I do more and I get more degrees, that's what's going to protect me. And that is not necessarily the case. So part of it is really those allies and those sponsors who are going to help you to understand and interpret what you're hearing. And I think we're going to need that on both sides, but it's most important for the women and the people of color who have typically been on the margins. That's, I think, how to change that space. It's no different in the academy, or if I study Congress. Congress is 85% white and male. I mean, that's astounding. That represents the entire nation. And so how do we change that? Right? These are sticky problems. They're sticky problems, but they're not impossible ones. And there are strategies out there already about how to do it.
Mm-hmm. I would just thinking about something I've heard Val say, who's not in the room, who's
right.
not at the table. And so as you look at, lean steering committees, as you look at Kaizen teams, as you look at who's leading the performance huddles, and who's taking part in that, who's underrepresented, who's not, at the huddle, at the table.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's all sorts of opportunities when you begin to ask that question and reflect on it. As a consultant, I lead those Kaizen teams. I help designate who the leaders and co-leaders are for those rapid improvement events. And so, I can begin having that conversation with leadership to say, hey, who might we, give an opportunity to lead.
Right. Well, if I may, then because those kinds of conversations are difficult, I think. So we can think about it right now, but doing it in action. Mm-hmm. And so how might you do that in action when you say, who is missing from this table and why are they important, right? And so, and part of it is that who would bring a valuable perspective that we don't have that is instrumental here. I think another thing, I helped to create an organization where there were a lot of women who were running the organizations. This was undergrads. And boy, they were so intolerant with the male student. And he was captain of the football team. He's clearly a leader. But he would not respond to the emails. These girls sent 75 emails, right? They were emailing all the time or texting each other, and they wanted him to be part of this communication stream, and he hated it. He wanted to be the person to come in, when are you making a decision? I'll help you make a decision, but I'm not going to do all of the debating. And they viewed that as him not showing interest and not being committed. It was a misinterpretation of the moment. But because the girls had power, they kicked them out of the leadership team. That's an unusual kind of circumstance, I think, but it's not so unusual in terms of how we evaluate. And the question that we need to ask, because what I think will often happen is we'll lock on to something that this person does differently from us, right? And we'll say that thing is the most important thing to determine the outcome. Mm-hmm. And we'll do it perhaps without being aware. That's the implicit kind of bias. Like one of the ways that we see it, if I may, just really briefly, is that we sometimes see it in classrooms. Again, I have 2 Black sons, so I see how it plays out. And I know that they get noticed for bad behavior. Mm. I mean, they are going to roughhouse, they're going to do whatever it is that they do in school. And they will be singled out from time to time. And they're good kids, I'll say that. But they will sometimes be singled out, and I will have to go in to say, who else was at the table? how did their, what kind of punishment did they receive, or what kind of reprimands did they receive? And it will often be the case that the reprimand is different. And I will need to bring it to someone's attention because they are unaware. And what I say is that the statistics are telling the story. This is not about you individually, but if I look at the statistics of what happens in public school education, it is that Black students are more highly disciplined than white students, that they are more likely to be expelled or suspended or to have other kinds of consequences. This is not accidental. It adds up, it aggregates from individual acts that people are engaged in without review, without check. And so these are the kinds of things that I think that we need to pay attention to.
So maybe just one other question on the conference gap, the inclusion, the diversity and inclusion gap. How quick, I mean, like if I were running a conference, well, conferences are happening right now, but a virtual conference, or I'm starting a new podcast and I'm looking to get, make sure I don't have blind spots and just invite the white males that I know and work with most.
Right.
Or let's say in any settings, like, because people will balk at the idea of, let's say, quotas. Like, well, you know, so, but what would you recommend that I'll personalize it. What should I do to make sure the people on stage reflect American society, that the guests that I have out on a podcast reflect society? I'll give credit. I think one conference that has at least made good efforts, I don't know their outcomes, but the Lean Startup Week event run by Eric Ries and others, they've made statements, I can find them on their website, saying we value diversity and we encourage. So how much should we just encourage people of all ethnicities and genders and race and you know, all elements of diversity? Encourage, like specifically say you are welcome, or how much do we have to like actively go out and network and seek out diversity? Is it enough to say like, hey, diversity is welcome? Versus, and again, Lean Startup Week, I know they've made those. We are going to actively try very hard to find those people because we know they're out there.
Right.
What, I mean, what would you recommend? What should I do? Again, all personal. What should I
hear you. I love the question. And I love some of the insights that you've already provided. So one of them is that how do we end up with homogenous kinds of outcomes? It's because we go to our own networks, and our networks are often fairly homogenous. They're filled with people who remind us of ourselves. That's part of why we like them, right? And so so when we go only to our own networks and our networks are not very diverse, these are the outcomes that we end up with. One of the things that we often hear in engineering or in higher education and in perhaps in nursing or in medical schools all over is this notion of a pipeline. And so they're like, oh, we need to build a pipeline. And I'm thinking, no, there's a whole pool out there, right? You can find it if you're looking. You have to have some intention. You do have to have some intention. And you have to recognize that oftentimes we perceive risk to be one-sided. So that a company will say, well, we're going to take a risk on this person. They may not be ready. And I'll put it in terms of gender. So we've never had a woman in this role before. We're going to take a risk. That means that person is on constant audition. But what we don't recognize there is that individual is also taking a risk, because they're walking into a culture that is not necessarily prepared for them, right? They're walking into an existing culture that says, I'm not sure that this new outsider belongs in this space. And so we need to recognize that there's risk-taking and there's trust-making on both sides of this, right? And so there may be some errors. So I think part of it is networks, part of it is culture. The other thing is that the assets and the talent that you have that is embodied in people who are people of color or women, right? The assets and resources that are embodied in them are not only directed to other women or to people of color. these people have lots of ideas. And so we need to not pigeonhole people only in talks about race or only, let's explore the degree of expertise that people have. I think another thing, particularly we find with women, one of the things, so we can think about op-eds or promotions or the work Lean In that so many people read, like, take a chance on yourself, bet on yourself. Oftentimes, women will spend a lot of time. They will wait an extra 10 years before they will try to go up for a promotion or try something big. Whereas men, I see it in my own classroom. I used to tell the students, like, this is the best chance you're ever going to have is to speak in a freshman class, right? Because nobody really knows that much. And I know that the guys at the end of the table are behaving as if they do, but you know as much as they do. And it doesn't get easier from here. But it is a different kind of relation to the culture and to the space, a different sense of belonging. And so we're going to have to encourage people who may not feel confident to do it. Mm-hmm. So there are, I think, for us in higher education, it would be postdocs, there may be internships, there may be fellowships, rewards, right? Recognition. Those are ways to get people to the table and to elevate them in ways that are meaningful. But I also think then that we also have to pay attention to measures. I'm keeping my eye on the time. But how do we measure this? You mentioned, oh my gosh, how, if we can't set a quota. Well, I've had some thoughts about that. I don't know exactly what the answers are. What I love about Lean is Lean has measures. So I'm expecting that we're going to find some creative ways to get at, the pluses and minuses that are helping people move through a system and, in whatever time period as a baseline, and that are slowing people down from doing it. We ought to at least be able to figure those variables out, right? Yeah. But at the end of the day, if you want to change a one-way street to a two-way street, you say that's what we're going to do. There's not a whole lot of conversation about it. And by some result of willpower, it gets done. When you say that we're going to have wireless everywhere so that people can use wireless technology, you do it. Like, there's not a whole lot of conversation about it. This is, to me, a matter of commitment and of stick-to-itiveness. And yeah. And
when you say you're going to increase sales year over year, or reduce errors year over year,
right?
You put that stake in the ground and you go for it.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone's on board, and leadership says, "Hey, this is what we're going to do," and you fall in line.
And you hold people accountable to it. I mean, what I loved about the safety example, that's what I couldn't remember earlier, is that I think the gentleman said 0 accidents or something like that. And I imagine, could you ever say 0 racism, right? Like, no racist incidents. That is audacious. But what if we could set that as a goal? Then we would leverage the resources to get there.
Well, that's a wonderful thing about Lean. Perfection is what we're striving to achieve.
If you look at, you mentioned earlier, Paul O'Neill, he's a very important leader. I was very fortunate to have met him briefly. He was a guest on the podcast here years ago. When he set that goal of saying at Alcoa, when he was CEO, nobody should get hurt at work. The goal was 0. Did they get to 0 in his time? No. But I'll guarantee they reduced harm far more significantly than if he had been timid and said, well, let's try to get a 5% reduction every year.
Right.
Kind of incrementalism versus saying, I think I've heard him use phrases like moral obligation, but then there was clearly a business case.
Right.
And business case not in a direct way, but in an indirect, saying if we get good at safety, we will have what he called habitual excellence. So injuries plummeted, stock price soared. But now at the same time, like, it was fascinating to hear people he worked with recounting stories. He would tell the accountants, don't ever calculate an ROI on something we installed for safety. He's like, that kills my moral authority. We'll fire you if you do that, right? So he had this balance of, like, yes, it made great business sense, but it's more of a long term. It's the right thing to do, and there's that longer term outcome as a business. It seems like that's the connection to diversity, equity, and inclusion, right?
Right. I love it. I think that the moral obligation piece, it really is measured in commitment. This is bigger than these other things, and I think it's values, right? What are the values that we adhere to?
And one thing I would suggest that maybe is helpful in these issues, Mr. O'Neill proved that there were the false trade-offs of people saying we can't afford safety.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely not true. People in healthcare are now showing, if anyone would say, well, we can't afford patient safety, false trade-off. Maybe the same thing applies if people say, oh, well, we can't afford diversity, equity, and inclusion. False trade-off.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
I would agree.
Absolutely. And costly. The illusion of that trade-off is so very costly. The problem with it is that it's in the periphery of our vision, and so we don't necessarily see it. But it accumulates, and it doesn't become less costly over time, and it's even more costly to the people who are in those margins. And so, but it's not without cost for the people who are in the majority. It's not, right? So. You pay me now, you pay me later. So, yeah.
Well, I want to thank you both for being so generous with your time and with sharing a lot of thought-provoking ideas and your experiences and in being leaders on all of these fronts. Our guests here today have been Chris Chapman and Dr. Valeria Sinclair-Chapman. So the consultant and the professor. The lean thinker and I'm dwindling down on ways of trying to describe your combination of insights and expertise, husband and wife.
Yes,
well. So,
yes, that's the biggest one.
Right.
Any so again to be respectful of your time, but I also want to give you the last word, each of you, if there's any final thought that's on your mind.
I'd just like to say thank you, Mark. I think you're exhibiting the kind of courage and curiosity, really, as you're grappling with how you might be a good ally in this challenge. And so you're going about figuring it out. And so I think this is very much a learning process. And will be for all of us. And lean is very much about continuous improvement and continuous learning. And so I think I'm learning a lot from Val. She's learning, lean language as well. And I think, influencers like yourself that are stepping up and figuring out how to be a good ally, taking time out to ask these kinds of questions that you don't know the answer to yet, but you're doing it. And often says, just do it, and that's what we're doing. And so we don't have all the answers yet, but hey, we're going for it. And I've got some learned lessons from over 20 years of lean experience. Val has just as much experience on her end, and like anyone that wants to make the world a better place, they're rolling up their sleeves to actually do something. And so I suspect this will be a hell of a journey. A lot of it will be experimental, as we like to do on our lean journey. And we'll continue to plan, do, check, and act our way to a better future state.
Yeah.
And again, I'll apologize for being late to trying to hop on the journey.
Yeah. No, I would just like to say thank you both for letting me eavesdrop on lean practices. I'm learning all kind of language and stories to tell. So we'll see. I'm going to take it back to my crowd, and they're going to be like, "What are you talking about?" But here we go. This is going to be an interesting kind of outcome. And just in terms of the work that we're all doing in the moment that we're being called for, this is the moonshot. Let's go big. Let's go big or go home. Mm-hmm. And let's let's actually see something real and grounded in terms of a shift, and we can do it. You know, we're all capable of it. So let's make something different than it was on May 24th. Let's make it different after that.
Yeah. Well, thanks again to the both of you. And Chris, I look forward to what are hopefully future articles in the series at lean.org, the Lean Post. The first one, again, for the listeners, if you want to go find these, Lean In, Lean Thinkers to Root Out Racial Inequity. And then the second article, Our Burning Platform and Using the 5 Whys to Think More Deeply about Corrective Action. So thank you for those. Chris, again, look forward to more. Encourage everyone to go check those out. Chris and Val, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Right.
Had
Thanks,
a great
Mark.
time. Thanks, Mark. Bye-bye.